Okay, hello everyone. So this is a lesson which gives you an introduction to our next topic. So for GCSE History with AQA, we've now completed all the work that we need to do for paper 1, which is Germany and conflict and tension, and we're beginning work on our paper 2 work, which we'll be doing, which we'll be sitting and examining at the end of year 11. So the topic that we're moving on to next, this one in red, is Elizabethan England, 1568 to 1603. So this topic covers lots of information about Elizabethan England and about the rule of Queen Elizabeth I. We'll look at Elizabethan politics, we'll look at life in Elizabethan times, we'll focus on things like the Globe Theatre and Shakespeare, and whether it was a golden age for England, and we'll be also looking at foreign policy, with a particular focus on the Spanish Armada as well. So it's a really interesting unit. We also have to look at a key historic site. So the key historic site that we need to study is called Kenilworth Castle, and we'll be studying that in a lot more detail, which is a castle in the Midlands, not far from Coventry. So we'll need to study that in quite a lot of detail as well. So the purpose of this lesson is going to be to go through the key question of who was Elizabeth I. So we're going to go through some of the different background information. What I'd like you to do is, just as we go through this, just make a few detailed notes about Elizabeth I, and in particular her background. Now, you won't particularly get questions on this in exam, but it's really important to understand the background of Elizabeth I to begin to understand her as a monarch. Now, Elizabeth ruled England from 1558 to 1603, so for a period of 45 years. So she was widely regarded as one of the most successful monarchs that we've ever had in this country, and gave her name to the age, the Elizabethan age. But what we're going to find out about in this lesson is the odds were very much stacked against her, and she had a pretty tough early start to her life. So very fascinating and interesting character, Elizabeth I. So this just gives you an overview of what we're going to find out about within this lesson. It's all about the background to Elizabeth I and find out who she was as a person, really. So Elizabeth I can be seen on this family tree. She was one of the Tudors, and you can see here where she fits in. She was the daughter of Henry VIII. But if we take it back to where it all started, the Tudor dynasty all started at the Wars of the Roses. And this man, Henry VII, was able to win the Battle of Bosworth Field and win the Wars of the Roses for Lancashire, for the House of Tudor. And they defeated the rival family, the Yorkists. The Yorkists were represented by the White Rose of Yorkshire, and Henry Tudor by the Red Rose. So what Henry Tudor, Henry VII, as he became known, did was he married Elizabeth of York, and they combined the red rose and the white rose together to make this, which was the symbol of the Tudors, the Tudor rose. And Henry VII set about to try and create a more stable monarchy and ensure that the Tudor dynasty, the Tudor family, would last for a very long time. So himself and Elizabeth of York had children. The eldest child was actually called Arthur, and unfortunately Arthur died as a teenager. But Arthur had married a Spanish princess called Catherine of Aragon, and this was an attempt to ally England and Spain together. This is what happened in that day and age. Spain was one of the most powerful countries at this time. But Arthur died, and that meant that Henry VII's second son, who would become known as Henry VIII, who we have probably all heard of, he was next in line to the throne. It's important to realise that Henry VIII was never supposed to be the monarch. It was supposed to be Arthur. But anyway, Henry VIII became king, and shortly before his 18th birthday, and he married Catherine of Aragon, who had, of course, been married to his older brother. And when Henry VIII became king, it was very exciting, he was very youthful, very energetic, and he hoped to be able to carry on this Tudor dynasty. So Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon, they had a child, a daughter called Mary, who would eventually become queen. But unfortunately, Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon were not able to have a son that was able to survive. Tragically, Catherine of Aragon had lots of miscarriages. There were children that died. So as Catherine of Aragon got older, Henry VIII decided that he needed to divorce Catherine of Aragon and get married again. And he'd also fallen in love with a lady called Anne Boleyn. Now, at the time, the Catholic Church would not allow Henry a divorce from Catherine of Aragon. So, in a nutshell, lots of different things happened. Henry VIII ended up getting rid of the Catholic Church from England in the so-called break with Rome. Got his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and ended up marrying Anne Boleyn. Now, when Henry VIII married Anne Boleyn, they had a child, and that child was Elizabeth, and she was born in 1533. And that's where Elizabeth started her life. So her father was Henry VIII, her mother was Anne Boleyn. Now, unfortunately for Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn was accused of having affairs, and she was also accused of being a witch and things like that. So Henry VIII had Anne Boleyn executed in 1536. Henry VIII then married again. His third wife was called Jane Seymour, and they did have a son who was called Edward, and he would eventually become king. And Edward was born in 1537. But tragically, Jane Seymour, Henry VIII's third wife, died a few days after childbirth. So that's where those three children came from. So three children, three different wives. But Henry VIII had his son, and he was the one that Henry VIII hoped would become king, destined to become king. So it's important that you're aware of this Tudor family tree and just understand it, because you can see here that some of the cousins become quite important, people like Mary Queen of Scots and Lady Jane Grey in the course as well. So let's just find out a little bit more information about the background of Elizabeth I. So one of the things to appreciate during this time is that religion changed a lot. So during the time of Henry VIII, England was a Catholic country, but he got rid of the Catholic Church from England and made England into what was called a Protestant country. This was called making the break with Rome, and England became Protestant. His son Edward VI made the church even more Protestant. He was quite a radical Protestant, so he made further changes to the church when he was the king between 1547 and 1553. However, when Edward died, the throne, although it briefly passed to a lady called Lady Jane Grey, the 9-day queen, she was executed, and Henry's first child, Mary, whose mother was Catherine of Aragon, she became the queen, but she changed the religion in the country back to being Catholic. She then ruled England for 5 years and earned the nickname Bloody Mary, and she would have Protestants burnt at the stake. There was a famous individual in Richmond called Richard Snell who was burnt at the stake in New Biggin in Richmond. And then when Elizabeth became queen in 1558, after Mary died, Elizabeth came up, and you can see here that is more in the middle. She came up with a religious settlement which was seen as a bit of a compromise, a middle way. So the church remained Protestant, but lots of Catholic ideas were tolerated within the church, and that created a religious settlement in England during that time. So religion is a big thing to be aware of, and this difference between the Catholic Church and the Protestant Church during this time. So the background to Elizabeth I. So as we've seen there on that that Tudor family tree, these are the parents of Elizabeth I, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth did become the heir to the throne when she was born, but when her mother Anne Boleyn was executed in 1536, she lost her right to inherit the throne. And at only 2.5 years old, her mother had been executed, estranged from her father. She was in quite a difficult position. So, as I said, in 1537, Henry VIII and his new wife Jane Seymour celebrate the arrival of a son called Edward. And in the rules in those days, the son's claim to the throne outweighed the daughter's. So that meant that Edward VI became, well, Edward as he was at the time, he would become Edward VI. Edward became heir to the throne. And Henry VIII released this portrait showing the different people within his family during that time. So during the 1540s, as Elizabeth grew up as a child, she hardly saw her father at all, and she actually spent most of her time living in various royal residences and royal palaces, but much of her time was spent in this place, which is called Hatfield House, which is in Hertfordshire. She did, however, receive a brilliant education. She could speak many languages. She was very, very intelligent. She had great tutors, which meant that when she became the monarch, when she was only 25 years old in 1558, she was very intelligent, she was well read, she was able to communicate well with people, etc. During the 1540s, Henry VIII was up to his sixth wife by then. His sixth wife, Catherine Parr, who's pictured here, looked after Elizabeth and did act as a mother figure towards her. So, in 1547, Henry VIII died, and this chap, Edward, became the King of England at only 9 years old, and he did bring about radical Protestant changes to England, although he was heavily influenced by the advisors surrounding him at that time. Tragically, though, he died at the age of just 15. And before he died, he named his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his heir because she was a Protestant and he didn't want the throne to pass to Mary. However, most people in England would not accept Lady Jane Grey as queen, didn't think that she was legitimate, and therefore there was basically a move against Lady Jane Grey. She got executed and Mary became the queen, and she became the monarch for 5 years. She was a Catholic, so Protestants were persecuted. She also married the Spanish king, who was called King Philip of Spain, which actually led to a rebellion in England called Wyatt's Rebellion in 1554. Elizabeth, being a Protestant herself, was often accused of treason. She was actually imprisoned in the Tower of London during this time, and she was put under house arrest at various times. However, Mary had no children, and she died in 1558, having succumbed to stomach cancer, and therefore the throne passed to Elizabeth. And it's said that Elizabeth was informed that she was going to become queen while sitting underneath an oak tree at Hatfield House, and apparently when she heard this news, she said, "This is the Lord's doing and it is marvellous in our eyes," and she was crowned the Queen of England in a big ceremony in Westminster Abbey on the 15th of January 1559. So Elizabeth had a pretty interesting upbringing. Her mother had been executed when she was only 2.5 years old. She didn't spend much time with her father. She didn't particularly get on very well with her brother Edward when he was king. She certainly didn't get on very well with her sister Mary when she was queen. But after all that, she would become queen in 1558. So in the next lesson, we're going to look at some of the problems that Elizabeth I would have as queen and how she might have gone about solving them. But that just gives you a little bit of background to who Elizabeth was and what kind of character she was as well. Thank you for listening.